Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, director of Roosevelt House, and I'm so excited to welcome you and honored and thrilled to have Senator Russ Feingold in the House. I'm the only one who'll be appearing this evening who has not served in the Congress, so it's a little bit inhibiting, but I was a congressional press secretary, and it was for Hunter alumna Bella Abzug, so I feel that I can take the stage. So, welcome on behalf of Ann Kirshner, the president of Hunter College. Thank you, Carolyn Maloney, for bringing this event to Roosevelt House. I'll have more to say about Carolyn. And again, thank you, Senator Russ Feingold, for gracing our historic setting this evening. I have to say both houses on Capitol Hill are noticeably less productive and reform-minded since those two giants left their work. But Roosevelt House is blessed to have you both on hand. Carolyn for nearly 2 years now in residence at Roosevelt House, and the senator to talk about his brand new book, The Constitution in Jeopardy, an unprecedented effort to rewrite our fundamental law and what we can do about it, which he has written with Peter Prindiville. And we're very proud that this event marks the renewal of the Chris McNichol Roosevelt House Lectures on Public Integrity. This is our first McNichol event in a few years. Not that we lacked for invitees with integrity. Well, we'll leave that one. It was really the lockdown that put the brakes on the series, and not to mention Chris's and Fred's absolutely extraordinary sailing adventure around the world, which they have almost completed, but apparently they can take brief trips back to the city, and then they go back to where the boat is and they continue until they say they've done the globe, which they have circumnavigated, and we're going to hear more about it, I hope, at some point. I think there's a book in the trip. So, Chris, you've written a few books already on Mayor Dinkins and Mayor Bloomberg. He also serves on the Roosevelt House Advisory Board and as a generous donor to our public programming. So before I introduce our guests, it's a pleasure to welcome back to the House, to Roosevelt House, to dry land, and to the podium, Chris McNichol.
Thank you, Harold. It's customary at these events to begin with a story about Franklin Roosevelt. Since I write about mayors, one of my favorites involves Mayor LaGuardia. Roosevelt, of course, was a Democrat. LaGuardia was a Republican and a Labor Party candidate, but Roosevelt always supported LaGuardia, much to the chagrin of his Democratic colleagues. But he came to New York one time during campaign season. He spoke to a group, probably not too different from this, and he said to them that our mayor, he called it our mayor because, of course, he lived here, he says, our mayor is the most appealing man that I know. He comes to Washington, he tells me a sad story. There's tears on my cheek. There's tears on his cheek. And the next thing you know, he's wrangled another $50 million out of me. Well, the numbers are smaller, but lunch with Harold Holzer is not much different. But his wife is laughing hardest. I'm very pleased to sponsor these events on integrity in government because the topic is so important. When people believe that the system is fair, they tend to do the right thing. When people think that the system is rigged, then they tend to do what they can get away with. They feel like they're being played for fools if they don't. And our political and economic systems over the last half century have been moving very far down a path that puts us at risk of operating in a plutocracy much more than a democracy. If you ask any 9 school children on the streets of New York if speech and money are the same thing, they'll tell you no, of course not. And if you ask 9 justices of the Supreme Court the same question, a majority will say that they are the same thing. And money's long been a corrupting influence in politics, but we used to put controls on it, and we've gotten away from that in a way that really is putting us at risk. And it falls to Harold to introduce our speaker tonight, Senator Feingold. But one of the points he makes in his book that really rings true is that ultimately in a democracy, if we're going to make the democracy work, it's up to us, the people. There's no magic formula. There's no foolproof process. we have to insist that our public servants act with integrity if we want our democracy to endure. And it's my hope that these lectures on integrity in government will serve at least as a modest reminder of that to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks for all you do for us wherever you are in the world. So as you know, tonight we're very proud to welcome former Senator Russ Feingold, born in Janesville, Wisconsin, where Abraham Lincoln once made a speech. I just wanted to point that out. He knew that. Elected to the state Senate before he was 30 years old, and after 10 years of service, elected to the United States Senate in 1992, re-elected in 2004, and he very nearly won the seat back 6 years after a very close loss in 98. His progressive record was consistent and strong. He was the only senator to vote against the first Patriot Act. He opposed the Iraq War Resolution and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act because, in his view, it didn't go far enough. And he supported the Immigration Reform Act of 2006. We have no idea what happened to that, but it's not here. He is probably and deservedly best known as the co-author of the extraordinary bipartisan McCain-Feingold Campaign Reform Act, which Chris was just alluded to, which heralded a new era of leveling the playing field in political campaigns until the Supreme Court gutted it. He has earned the John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award, served since his Senate days as a State Department envoy in Africa, and now serves as president of the American Constitution Society, which is a major think tank advocacy group and, among other things, a counterbalance to the Federalist Society. He previously wrote the best-selling book, While America Sleeps, kind of a riff on a Kennedy title, I guess. Now that he has turned his attention to a quiet movement that lives among so-called strict constructionists to perhaps entirely replace the U.S. Constitution. Joining him for the conversation, which I will also join, again with thanks for inviting Senator Feingold, is our own Eleanor Roosevelt Distinguished Scholar in Residence, Carolyn Maloney, who served for decades as Congresswoman from the east side of Manhattan and other areas, including Hunter College, and has been serving here at Roosevelt House since she left office, with a particular emphasis on either getting the ERA ratified or having an acknowledgement that it has already been ratified. So the format is the following. Tonight, both Carolyn and I will be asking the senator some questions. Then we will ask you to join in the conversation. And afterwards, we'll invite you all to join us in the Four Freedoms room upstairs, the former Roosevelt dining rooms, to raise a glass to Senator Feingold. And we hope for you to get an inscribed copy of the Constitution in jeopardy. So with that, and one urging that you please silence whatever devices you may have on hand. We are broadcasting on Zoom to a large audience tonight, and we'd love them to have a seamless experience. So with that, please welcome to the stage Senator Russ Feingold and Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. So, Senator, welcome again. And I guess my first question, it's a rather general one, but we always ask our visiting authors, what motivated you to take up this issue and to turn it into a book?
Well, thank you. It's an honor to be here with you. I'm one of the great scholars of Lincoln of all time, and really enjoyed talking with you before. Carolyn Maloney was one of the great members of Congress. There's no exaggerating there at all. We came in the same day. She lasted 12 years longer than I did. But, you know, battle after battle, this was one of the most effective, wonderful members of the Congress the whole time I was there. So I thank you so much for inviting me to this. And I will answer your question, but I am going to thank the McNichol Lecture very much for this honor. And just to be in this building, goodness, I didn't realize when I came here last night what had happened here. I knew many of the incidents, but I didn't know they all happened here, involving Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. I grew up in a home where there were heroes, Adlai Stevenson fighting Bob La Follette, but the hero of heroes was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So an honor and kind of a chilling thing to even be here. Now, in answer to your question, it's a little convoluted. I was, as I like to say, given my gold watch by the people of Wisconsin in 2010. Actually, I didn't get a gold watch. I just had to leave. But I needed a job. And so I was fortunate to get asked to teach law at various law schools, Marquette and Yale and Harvard and Stanford. And they said, well, here's a course maybe you could teach. You know, basically a legal view of the Constitution through the eyes of the U.S. Senate. They thought maybe I could pull that off. So I was teaching this course about the U.S. Senate, you know, filibuster law, holds, all the crazy stuff that we did that you guys didn't do. But I started thinking a little bit about the fact that the members of Congress had this critical role in terms of amending the Constitution. Of course, 2/3 of both houses have to pass a constitutional amendment before it goes to the states, where 3/4 of the states have to ratify it. But what was less known and became more interesting to me as I was teaching was this other provision, the alternative, which is that a constitutional convention can be called if 2/3 of the states, 34 states now, apply for a constitutional convention. And so there's a long history to it we can talk about, but I began to realize that there was a pretty serious and growing right-wing movement to call a constitutional convention that's been going on ever since, guess who was elected? Barack Obama. As we all know, a lot of this stuff happened around then, and all of a sudden, there's all kinds of applications for this. And I started following it and thinking about it and teaching about it. And so finally, one of my students, the smart guy that's the other name on here, he said, you have to write a book about this. And I said, I just took a job as a full-time head of the American Constitution Society. You have to help me. Well, he did more than help me. He did most of the work. And so I wanted to basically get a warning out there. People had no idea that this is going on. It is dangerous, and we can talk about why, but I was motivated by realizing that the public didn't know about this. And of course, people like Linda Greenhouse is just a wonderful person, scholar. And I said to her, would you blurb my book? She goes, oh, I'm so busy. And she reads it, she goes, you scared me. You know, here's a scholar who didn't, just like me, didn't realize that this was lurking. And it's more than lurking now. So that's a long answer, but it's how I got there.
So she says the book is a wake-up call. I join her among the masses of people who did not know that there was a movement to call a constitutional convention, or New York has called 5 or 6 constitutional conventions. They always end up with a document that's more convoluted and less comprehensible than the previous one. And no one really knows about it. They just vote in referenda to call a convention. Where are these lodges and meetings happening? Where are these discussions to redo the Constitution occurring?
Well, I'm sure you remember the Koch brothers who financed the destruction of organized labor in Wisconsin in 2010, well, they finance other things too. They finance something called ALEC, which I'm sure you've heard of, is a right-wing, basically think tank in operation that proposes very conservative legislation and delivers it to the states so they can try to pass this. Well, one of the things that came out of this sort of milieu of the Tea Party and that was a guy named Meckler decided to form something called Convention of the States, which was an attempt to take right-wing legislators from every state and bring them together to start practicing a convention. So they did one in 2013, didn't go so well. But then they had one in Virginia, in Kingsmill, in 2016. And they went through the whole process. As we write in the book, if you read nothing else in the book, you should get it, but if you read nothing else, read chapter 5, which is entitled, I should say, my wife always corrects me, it's not entitled, it's titled, What Trump and the Tea Party Couldn't Do, the Modern Conservative Push and the Mirage of a Limited Constitutional Convention. So they did, for several days, they held meetings, they did amendments, they had delegates from every state, they approved some things, they went against some things, but people laughed about it. But in fact, it was done in a very sort of professional way. They just reconvened last year, and they passed resolutions, and we can talk about one of the problems is the way they vote on the resolutions is one vote per state. So this is a critical thing if constitutional amendments are going to be this way. And they had it in Virginia, and I'll talk about it more later, but the thing that passed unanimously that caused them all to get up and stamp up and down is what I call the John C. Calhoun Amendment. They wanted that if just 26 states vote to eliminate a law of Congress or an administrative rule, that it's gone. Nullification. This is what they're about. And so they are practicing, and they are fairly sophisticated.
Is this an attempt to redraft everything or add a second Bill of Rights, like a Bill of Unrights, that would modify the original? Because the anomaly to me is that the strict constructionists, the people who are reading the Constitution as a fundamentalist document that can't be reinterpreted, right? The Alitos and of the world are also probably sympathetic to this clarification. So it's not the entire Constitution, right? Or it can be either.
Well, this is one of the weird things about this. They claim, and we think it's a ruse, that it will be very limited, that it would just be about, well, basically, to us it's not limited, most of us, they want to basically gut the federal government and take away its powers to do anything about climate change or anything. That's what they put out there as their main goal. But they claim that such a convention could be limited in topic. That's not what most legal scholars believe, including the famous Charles Black of Yale Law School. Most people think it cannot be limited, and they're saying this so they can have a free-for-all. But their main objective, it appears, although it will probably involve things like going against gay marriage and abortion and so on, their main objective is to gut the federal government and essentially return us to the Articles of Confederation. That's essentially what they want. Is we dealt with this forever. Their goal was to destroy the federal government and its powers. So
and regulations
yeah,
as well.
but it would be open. Yes, definitely regulations. And of course, they may do that in the next few weeks just to the Supreme Court. That's another story. But this would enshrine it permanently, or semi-permanently, in a way that Supreme Court decisions aren't always. But they could do anything, but I think they're going to lead with this sort of economic stuff if they have the opportunity.
And just before I turn it over to Carolyn, I reread Article 5 at the suggestion of your book. It's kind of convoluted, isn't it? I mean, it's a danger, but it's kind of a guarantee that it takes a big majority. Now you're saying 26 states. So tell us a little bit about the mysterious Article 5.
This is one of the ironies. Our book, we talk about the twin jeopardies to the Constitution. Jeopardy number one is one I've been talking about. Jeopardy number two is it's the hardest on Constitution in the world to amend. It's almost impossible to get anything through something that needs to be done because it requires either 2/3 of both houses of Congress, which good luck right now on that, 3/4 of the states, or it requires this constitutional convention, which then still has to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. But the jeopardy there is that you can't get changes that really are just obviously need to be done, like getting rid of the Electoral College or having a right to vote. I like to say that the framers did a pretty good job, but they were very weak on climate change. Unlike every modern constitution, there's no provision in there having to do with the environment. So we're in this weird situation where they might be able to use this convention route because it's basically gerrymandered. It's basically tilted toward very small rural states. They might be able to do it, but the mechanisms are not currently available. So we do propose at the end of the book changes in Article 5. But those are the two. I can tell you how it ended up that way. It had something to do with our friend Hamilton and so on and so forth. It's very interesting. But
the Calhoun part that's more chilling and nullification.
Yeah, that's right.
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Harold, and thank all of you for coming tonight, and Chris for sponsoring this. It's a great honor to have you at Roosevelt House, Senator. And you are known for many significant achievements. My two favorites are your historic work on McCain-Feingold, which I had the honor of working with you in the House on, and also your leadership on the Equal Rights Amendment. We are very close in the House of Representatives to getting close to a motion to discharge. We have 211 co-signers. We just need a few more. And I'd like to ask you, can you talk about why you think the ERA has met all of the constitutional requirements and that the archivist should publish it as the 28th Amendment? And I want to thank you for the wonderful memo the American Constitution Society, which you are now president of, wrote in support of it. Thank you.
Well, this came from the same crazy seminar. You know, I wasn't focused on, I was trying to teach what had happened with constitutional amendments throughout American history. And, you know, just like everybody else, I think on the Article 5, I assumed that the ERA was a dead letter, even though, of course, I had always supported it. And Wisconsin had ratified it. I just assumed that that time limit correctly reflected the way the Constitution is set up. But then we started looking at it a little bit in the course, and a friend of mine said there's a woman named Kamala Lopez from LA, an actress, who's starting a movement to get the 38th state, Virginia, to ratify. You need 38 states. And she says to me, she came to the class, in 2019, she said, we're going to get the 38th state, and by this time next year, I'm coming back to your class, and we'll be in court. And I kind of laughed. She was completely right. They did it. They changed the legislature in Virginia. They ratified it. 38 states. And we took a good look at Article 5. And there is no requirement, in fact, there's no permission for there to be a time limitation. There is nothing in the Constitution that allows that. Now, the court has said once that they think it's okay, but frankly, George Mason was the opponent of Hamilton. The goal at the Constitutional Convention the first proposal in the Virginia plan was to allow amendments only by the states, only by convention, and to not allow Congress to have any role at all, which makes sense. Why would you let Congress control that? So Hamilton, hanging back, you know, they go into what's called the Committee on Detail, and they propose an alternative. It comes out, and it says only Congress can do it. The people can't do it. They can't do it through petition. And the vote was 9-1. Hamilton wins the vote. And they come down to the last 2 days of the Constitutional Convention, and George Mason says, if you don't change this provision, we're leaving. So they throw in this provision that allows a constitutional convention with absolutely no clarity about the rules. Nonetheless, the fundamental aspect of a constitutional amendment has nothing to do, and this is where the ERA comes in. The president has no role. The Supreme Court has no role. It is entirely, if you have a constitutional convention or through Congress, it's merely an act through the state legislatures and the Congress. And the Congress has no discretion, actually, to mess around with this. So we have all come to the conclusion, and now we have some of the top legal scholars in the country, like Lawrence Tribe of Harvard and others, all agree that it should be published right now. It is the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And we're trying to get a certain person in the White House, who I happen to like, even though I run a nonpartisan organization, we want him to publish it because we think it's the law of the land.
Well, thank you for that. And bringing us up to the present right now, there was one quote in your book that I found particularly disturbing from former Senator Rick Santorum, and I'd like to read it to you. We're planning on putting resources, people in place to get us to where the safety's off, and we have a live weapon in our hands. Wow. Would you comment on this quote and where we are and the tactics of the right to push now, and why are you so concerned now about a constitutional convention?
Yeah, even though they didn't have a transcript of the Constitutional Convention, I'm fairly confident that's not the kind of language that Madison and Benjamin Franklin and others were using. They weren't describing what they were doing as a grenade. And yet this reflects this anger in the country. And I know this is on tape and it's going to be recorded, but I'm not running for office anymore. So I'll just say, I used to think the guy that said that, Rick Santorum, was the worst person in the world. I learned otherwise. Nonpartisan. But that's the kind of language that is used to describe what this is essentially trying to do, frankly, is put in the U.S. Constitution a version of America that reflects strong white supremacy interests and desires, and to fend off the natural democratic majority that is developing in this country. That's what this is really about. So that's why they want this big solution. Look, the members of the Supreme Court are not immortal, and there will be other justices. And no matter what they've done, it could be undone through simply a 5-4 decision. Constitutional amendments are a lot tougher. And so this is the, one Ohio state senator referred to it as like some creature in Lord of the Rings, like some monster that can come out and do this. So it's pretty wacky. And it's tied in with a number of other disturbing trends, gun training. There was a long article in The Atlantic last year where people were brought in, trained about this, and also trained to shoot guns. It's all part of this bizarre situation.
What are the greatest risks that you see that could come out of a constitutional convention?
Well, it's what I mentioned earlier, but their leading priorities are to eliminate the income tax completely, which a constitutional amendment had to be passed to allow the income tax after it was struck down by the Supreme Court in the late 19th century. They want to basically take away the power of Congress and administrative agencies to deal with basically anything. Any of their problems. They wouldn't have had the flexibility to deal with COVID. They wouldn't have had the ability to deal with climate change. And then they want to create this veto of everything, essentially
By the states.
by the states. And by the way, by state legislatures.
Right.
It's not your governor. It's not your Supreme Court. It's this whole thing, which is also reflected in another one of these things, this independent state legislature theory. I think you know that the court didn't buy into it, but the idea that, if there's an election and Joe Biden wins Wisconsin by 200,000 votes and the Supreme Court agrees, the state legislature can say, no, Trump won. So it's all part of this basically trying to take away the notion of a union of the states and we the people.
And you mentioned in your book that we need to could possibly change Article 5, and you suggest a commission being formed, bipartisan commission, to come up with recommendations. What are some of the recommendations that you would put forward to change it in any way?
Well, I think what we have to do is have it easier to amend the Constitution, but also it has to be more majoritarian in nature. So ratification, instead of ratification by 3/4 of the states, what you might have is that a majority of the states have to approve it by a popular vote, not by the legislature, but then also a national majority, so that the total vote in the country would be a majority. That would be one way to make it so that the only kind of amendments that could get through are those that are essentially tilted toward the smaller rural areas. Another thing is to maybe lower the bar somewhat in the House and Senate ones. Instead of 2/3, maybe 60 vote, or a slightly lower majority to do that. But also an amendment that would give the Congress the ability to make some rules. This is one of the things I haven't mentioned. There are no rules at all for how this convention is supposed to occur. So these right-wingers have drafted legislation that allows them to have legislatures pick the most conservative members, and then there are no rules about what the topics can be, whether there's any limitation, and there's no rules about how the voting should proceed. And this is where they come up with this, each state gets one vote. And we all know what that means. And the population tendencies are becoming even stronger, where there's more people leaving the rural areas and going to the larger states. That means you're going to end up with something that is very, very tilted and away from the will of the people. So this is a very dangerous part of it.
Let me ask, if this should come to pass, and I still hope it's a remote possibility that we are now alerted to, are people with a more progressive view of the Constitution holding mock events as well? Is the other side practicing for this potential cataclysm?
Not as much, but there are some progressive groups who are willing to pull the ripcord on this, that are saying, let's try it, let's see what happens. And some people I really respect, Lawrence Lessig at Harvard and Sandy Levinson at Texas. Now, these guys came up with their belief that we should have a constitutional convention before they saw certain people emerge in this country. It was in the 2000s. And now they're sort of, at least Levinson is saying, I'm not so sure we need to have some rules for this thing. But there are groups, such as a group called Wolfpack, which wants to do something I wouldn't necessarily be against, which is they want to pass a constitutional amendment to override Citizens United. You know, it's something to do with campaign finance. I don't think it's best to do it by constitutional amendment, but they want to have constitutional convention to do that. Others want to do it for other progressive reasons, but it's pretty limited. And the general view is it's too dangerous because how would they control it? How, in most of the states, it would be controlled by very far right-wing people. So, no, it's not happening that way. And let me give you a little good news because so much of this sounds kind of scary. One of the things that can be done is states like New York that have passed resolutions for constitutional conventions in the past can rescind them. And in fact, New York's close to doing that. Other states have rescinded them. So before the thing is actually called, they need 34 states. We're part of a coalition with Common Cause, ACS, and others, where every week we look at, is it happening in North Carolina? And apparently today there's a fear that's going to pass in Louisiana. But there's also rescissions being attempted, so to try to make sure they don't get to the 34. But yes, there are people, particularly some young people, who think, I happen to think a properly conducted under a new Article 5 constitutional convention might be a good thing. But the way it's set up now, it really can't come out any other way than being a right-wing controlled thing. So that's probably why they're not doing it.
Does the idea of it being state by state go to the court, or do they rely on the precedent of the original Constitutional Convention to be state by state? I mean, how do you
Nobody knows.
adjudicate stuff like this?
I mean, nobody knows, and the court probably would say it's a non-justiciable issue. It would probably say there's nothing in here that allows the court to intervene because there's no language in the Constitution that tells you how it should be done. They may simply deem it, as the justices do, a political question. Now, if the proposals involve getting rid of the Supreme Court, maybe they'd change their mind. In fact, one of the things they want to do, one of the amendments, is to pass a constitutional amendment permanently limiting the court to be 9 people. That's one of the progressives.
wake of the
progressives want to do is possibly add seats. So yeah, this is. My gut tells me if it's the normal Supreme Court, they wouldn't touch this thing, even though it would be potentially cataclysmic.
Why should Americans take this seriously and serious right now? And I'm going to quote from your book, from your writing, and you say, as you say in the book, you say, and I quote, "Those who would likely find the results most disturbing, including progressives, liberals, many moderates, and perhaps even some conservatives, tend to discount the threat. Quite frankly, I had not considered it such a threat until I read your book. So why is it such a serious threat right now?"
Well, first I want to tell you that, of course, one of the first places we went as we were preparing to try to write the book, we wanted the New York Times to editorialize on this. And I spoke to somebody at the Times editorial board, and he said, there's no chance of this happening. And it reminded me of a story of your great Senator Moynihan, who we were sitting in the caucus one time, and some of the rural senators got up and said, you know, you guys need to get out there and read your hometown newspapers. You guys are doing all that. When he said, Mr. President, he says, the New York Times is my hometown newspaper. That's only Moynihan could do it. The question again, I had to do one of my anecdotes. So
why is it such a serious threat now?
Well-
And why should we take it so, well, I know why we should take it so seriously, but why?
Because they
why
might
now?
be able to somehow get these 34 states. Now, another one of the things
And they're at what, 33?
it depends. Now, here's the problem. There's all these different applications, hundreds of them. Question is, what can you count and can you aggregate them? So there's like 26 for a balanced budget amendment. There's like 18 for this convention of the states. There's ones to say we should get rid of slavery. There's ones that say we should have a Bill of Rights. Well, the right is claiming, and once, in fact, Kansas is suing, saying you can just combine these.
Because they're all asking for
Because
a
they're asking for a convention,
examination.
and there's nothing in the Constitution that says you can limit it. You know, they're sort of trying to have it both ways. So, you know, would the Supreme Court question that? I think not. And there was a congressman who was the leading advocate, one of the two leading advocates for saying, as of last January, that there already were enough petitions. And his name is Johnson.
Oh, no.
He's now the speaker. So the thing to look for in terms of, we are all kind of wondering about November, I think that's fair to say. If things go a certain way in November, I'm being careful with my words, this probably won't have a lot of momentum. But if it goes another way and somebody gets reelected, this thing could become hypercharged. So that's the thing to watch is, you know, depend what happens. Of course, if they don't control, the Republicans don't control the House and the Senate, then it would be much more difficult for them to pass a resolution acknowledging that there are enough petitions.
Is part of this a frustration that in an almost evenly divided House and Senate, there is no other path to amendments? Which was, as you pointed out,
I would say
so
that's,
difficult
I
to
mean,
pass.
Carolyn may know more than I would. I would say some things over time, like the balanced budget amendment, some of those things led to frustration where people feel like, because the Senate defeated the balanced budget amendment twice, and I was involved in that by one
What
vote.
about the Equal Rights Amendment? That's been around for 100 years.
Yeah, well, that's fair.
100 years.
And
And
of
we
course,
met the qualifications
yeah.
of Article 5.
that's what gets confusing about this, is the law relating to a constitutional convention is different than the law of ratification. So when it comes to ratification, that, you know, basically once a state ratifies, it's basically considered done. They can't undo it. But petitions are considered, it's very technical stuff.
And
but
Were
this
you
is-
saying that New York, I'm sorry, Carol, were
Yeah.
you saying that New York has passed a resolution calling for and needs to rescind?
in the past, it's called for resolutions, I think, to get rid of slavery and
Oh, I see,
for
the
other
old
things. Yeah.
Oh, that one.
Yeah, you know, things, but some of them more modern. But there is, I think they may have the votes to rescind all of them, which is what Illinois did a couple years ago. You know, they had all these, you know.
So does
you
that
may
mean the
remember
state can rescind DRA? That's, you know.
No, that's the distinction, is that a petition can be rescinded by a legislature. And, you know, it was a previous legislature, they can say, we don't want to do this anymore. But once you have ratified an amendment, we would have nothing but chaos in this country if you pass a constitutional amendment and then people can say, oh, actually, we weren't for it anymore.
Well, they,
You know,
they
so,
did it,
but
right?
but this is, and this is one
Yeah.
where the courts would have to get involved and say, you know, how it should be counted. But I think that's the way it would work. But yeah, it's a very different situation.
And there have been rescissions and there have been court cases about it, and they said you can't do it. There have been some rescissions on amendments or attempts to, and the courts have ruled that you cannot rescind precisely for what he said. Nothing would be stable in the country.
Well, on the ERA, exactly.
Right.
There are 6 states that have rescinded their
Right.
ERA ratification, and the general view is they cannot do that.
Well, I
Which is
think one
why
of the
the
con-
archivist should
Yeah,
certify.
go ahead and sign it.
Yeah.
But I think one of the main things that you're pointing out is there are no rules, no mechanisms, nothing's in place on this. There's no way to go forward. If you did have a convention, how would you organize? What would be the rules? The Constitution is totally silent in that area.
Well, you know, we'd have to amend the Constitution to allow the Congress to pass enabling legislation. And, you know, to actually make the rules, which, you know, makes some sense. Although you can't let them go too far, or what you're doing is essentially allowing Congress to control it too much, which was not the intent. But basic rules about how delegates should be selected, I would think there'd be a rule that all delegates have to be popularly elected in their states, not just chosen by the legislature. You know, that it would actually be a democratic process to elect people. That would be important. And then, not being able to mix and match petitions from the Civil War in 1792 and things like that. And then that the voting should be proportional, based on population, not based on one vote per state. Those changes have to occur, and they can only occur by constitutional amendment. So when this whole thing was close to happening, Illinois, it was a reaction to the reapportionment decisions that came down. Baker versus Carr, Merrill versus Sims said the state senates have to be, apportioned according to population. This was very upsetting to people, including Senator Everett McKinley Dirksen of Illinois, who actually had helped pass the civil rights law. But the rural states and the rural legislators did not like the idea of changing it. So first he tried to pass a constitutional amendment through Congress, wasn't able to do it, and then he led a charge for a constitutional convention. And this started to really worry people like Senator Bobby Kennedy, and Sam Ervin and others started proposing legislation that would have provided rules. It never passed. Whether or not it would have been binding in any way, that's the difficult question.
So I think we'd love to get, oh, I see we already have a hand. If we have a microphone downstairs, we have a lot of questions, but we'll thank the senator for the opening. Do we have mics? I think you had your hand up first, so wait for the mic.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to meet you, Senator Feingold, and I've had the pleasure of speaking with you in past programs. I've been doing some heavy-duty research for a blog that I write. I've been working on fascism, and most people don't know that you need a democratic form of government in order to have a fascist state, become a fascist state, which, oddly enough, fascism in the United States is known as American populism. Some of the people whom I've been reading include
You need to get to a question.
Federico Finkelstein and Ruth Ben-Ghiat. How do you see the parallels between what's going on in this country right now and the Weimar Republic?
Well, of course I'm concerned. I mean, I'm not a scholar on the Weimar, although I do recommend Babylon Berlin as a great thing. Look, there is a trend throughout the world that is very complicated, and that is that democratic mechanisms, constitutional mechanisms, are being used to, as you were suggesting, to implement right-wing constitutions, such as Orban, or forms of government. It's being used in some Islamic countries to institute Islamic law through a constitutional process. That's what you have to remember about what I'm talking about. This is perfectly legal. You can't say this is some screwy thing. It's what the Constitution says. If 2/3 of the states ask for this, it can be done. So that's one of the dilemmas of democracy, is, as you should suggest, a populist vote to choose to basically undercut the whole concept can be done. And what the founders were trying to avoid, what the framers were trying to avoid, in one of our chapters is called Bloodless Revolution, they were trying to figure out a way to fix things and change things without having to have another revolution. But, if you got in that kind of situation, God knows.
Michael, right here.
Yes, Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. My question is, come on, the ACLU disagreed with you on campaign financing. They're a liberal organization, they're not conservatives. So on a constitutional convention, do you really think that 21st century America would, for example, go back to slavery, go back to racial segregation, and put that in the Constitution? Come on.
No, I actually don't think those would go through, but I think a whole series of things would be done that would institute in a more permanent way white supremacy in this country through various means. So I think it's worth being concerned about.
Right here, and then I'll go to this side, sorry.
Hi, thank you very much. Could you explain the petition process? Who does the petition go to? What's the mechanism for that happening?
Really interesting question. Well, first of all, it has to pass, it's believed, both houses of a state legislature. And they have governors sign it in some of these states, like our governor, but it's not required. It's just a legislative act. So you'd think, given the fact it's in the Constitution, that there would be a record of what's come in. Well, your buddies that came in 2011, Boehner and those people, what were they calling themselves again? The Tea Party. The Tea Party set up, and it's legitimate, I think. They set up a mechanism to keep track of these petitions. They should. But the motivation was to, sort of know what petitions had been filed and what you had. So there now is a website and a place where you can go and see what petitions have been filed. So they are on file in the U.S. Congress. But it wasn't for many years because it was considered like something that would never happen. It's never happened, as you know. It's just, this has never happened since the founding of the country.
Yes.
Where are we in terms of the count? Are we at 33 of 34?
No.
And how far are we away? And if it were to pass, what can it be done at that particular point in time to put safeguards in this convention, or is it just basically a free-for-all?
I mean, if you only allow one topic or like ones that are the same, the most you'd be at is about 27 or 28. That would be the balanced budget amendment. If you want this broader one that these folks want to kind of dismantle the government, they're only about 18. But if you can combine them, they're way over. And that's why Mike Johnson and people like that and Kansas believe that they can file a lawsuit and say there's enough of them. We just don't know. So what happens if they call the convention, right? We're in a constitutional chasm. What would happen? Would the Supreme Court intervene? It would be a constitutional crisis. And this is why Steve Bannon loves this. Steve Bannon had this on his show. This is his top priority because they want a crisis for reasons of fascism and other reasons. They want a crisis. So what, I'm sure most of us, I'm guessing, would not say, oh, good, there's going to be a constitutional convention. It's not legitimate, many of us would say, the way they did it. But who's going to resolve this? It would be a very odd moment.
We have one. I promised this gentleman he'd get the next one.
Hi, Mike Diedrich. I'm a practicing lawyer, not a philosopher, but I was reading Hannah Arendt's book on revolution, and it seems to me that the problem here is a huge problem in that we could have 34 states overrule 16 states, and that could be a disaster. But the bigger disaster or problem, as I see it, is that Americans aren't studying civics, don't understand our democracy, and our democracy is at risk. And if the people understood our democracy better, like Hannah Arendt explains in her book on revolution, that's what we need. We need American people to understand democracy first, because if they do, they won't allow this to happen.
Well, I completely agree. There I was in Janesville, Wisconsin in 8th grade by being taught all about the Constitution. I mean, we weren't the smartest kids on the planet, but we all knew the basic provisions of the Constitution by the end of 8th grade. And that doesn't happen anymore. And it's a terrible thing. Now, that's why you should support the American Constitution Society, because we have a program called Constitution in the Classroom. And we have volunteers go into the classrooms all over the country, give out free little copies of the Constitution. There are many aspects of civic education that need to be improved greatly, but I think the constitutional gap is enormous. People have no idea anymore.
It's interesting. Secretary Clinton was here last week on behalf of one of the Hyde Park foundations. And someone asked her, what was your first year like at Columbia, where she's teaching? And she said, well, if you would have told me it was what the campus was going to be like this year, I might not have gone. But she also said the students don't know history. They don't know Middle East history. They don't know Ukraine and Russia's history. They don't know American history. How can we conduct conversations or civilly argue about global and national and local problems without that knowledge. So two great ex-senators have the same view
There
on
are
civics.
bills in Congress to require more government classes. To require government classes, a lot of schools don't even teach government
No.
anymore. And civics classes, and I certainly support them.
I mean, it doesn't work. I mean, I like to read a lot about languages and development of languages. What countries have done in forming their countries. France, most of the people didn't speak French as of the French Revolution. What they do in countries to make sure there's a common language is a big thing, but a common understanding of the system of government is also essential.
I hate interrupting the flow, but you've moved me to ask a question because of your comments about your 8th grade education. So how did a nice boy in Wisconsin decide to commit his life to public service?
Well, when I used to, the kids come to see you in Congress from the schools. You go down and you meet the fourth graders, and why'd you go into politics? And I said, well, when I was 7 years old, who was elected president? And they go, Lincoln? And I go, no, it's not Lincoln. It's a little wise guy in the back. John F. Kennedy, And so I made the mistake, because I was in 1st grade, I had glasses and, just kind of a little bit of a nerdy guy. And I said, started telling all the relatives that I was going to be the first Jewish president. And they I don't think so. And that was hung around my neck at every gathering. Well, it still is. Anyway, what did you ask me again?
I get it, President Kennedy.
Yes.
That was for Clinton and for a few others.
With the inspiration?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's actually a sad piece to it. So I got totally into it because that's all, another thing I like to say is that our dinner table, there were 2 things, according to Midwesterners, you're not supposed to talk about: religion and politics. That's all my parents talked about. So they got me and my little sister the first woman rabbi in the history of Wisconsin, because that's what they talked about. But my dad really had me going on to politics. And, of course, I became a teenager and was a little rebellious. And he was a Lyndon Johnson guy, and I was a Bobby Kennedy guy. And there I am, 14 years old. And one night, of course, JFK is assassinated, a hero of mine. And then Martin Luther King is assassinated. And then Bobby Kennedy is assassinated. And I'm 14 years old. And I literally thought, I'm going to do something to continue that. It was very searing. And then following that, mostly, we grew up in a time of not the beginning, but in many ways the beginning of, it seemed like so many key movements. Civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War movement, the women's movement, the LGBTQ movement, environmental movement, all these things were going on. I mean, this is literally between 1963 and 1971. And that's sort of how I became completely enamored of the idea of being in politics. But I frankly almost don't recognize it anymore.
I promised this gentleman a question. Sorry, I'm making Mike Handler race through the aisles.
Thank you for this fascinating and alarming conversation.
Just what people need right now.
That's what we need. Senator, can you say a word or two about the interstate compact that is forming to have direct election of the president and how it differs from the amendment process?
So there's a separate constitutional provision that allows interstate compacts. Interstate compacts can be formed by different states together, and if it's a certain type of topic, the Congress has to approve it. But one of the ideas, they call this a constitutional workaround, is that what you would have is enough states agree that whoever wins the popular vote, like Hillary Clinton or whoever, John Kerry, or maybe he didn't win it, but Hillary Clinton, Al Gore, that state will vote all its delegates for that person, state law. I've been working with people on this. So when I was teaching at Yale, we got it through in Connecticut. They're getting close to having this compact form. Now, it would have to be approved by a friendly Congress. And then that would go to the Supreme Court. And I'm not optimistic about how they would treat it, but it's a very interesting question. And I think it is probably constitutional if you look at it clearly as a legal matter. It's a compact. Some would say it's a denying people the right to vote because their state's not, that they voted for somebody who won the national election. It's very complicated. But yeah, it's a national voter participation program, and it's an interesting movement.
I think we'll do two more, the two who have first here and then this gentleman here.
Thank you very much. Thank you for disturbing my sleep for the next couple of weeks. I need it, but I'll catch up. Two areas. One big one, my background is architecture, and the most important part of a building is the foundation. So I've always been thinking about the fact that the whole system of electing a president is crazy. You only need 150 people to elect a president based on the fact that there is no minimum amount of votes to get to the all or nothing kind of thing. That's a big subject. My question is this. Since the oath of office is like a contract, and when a president swears to uphold the Constitution, could we instill a requirement that the person who has been elected has read the Constitution?
Well, read and understood, or just
I would
read?
settle for just read.
I suppose. How do you? I mean, I have a feeling that certain people would say they've read. In fact, it probably would not work. But it's certainly something that. I mean, it is good that our current president was taught constitutional law, I think.
Yeah. All right. Our last question is right here.
Yes, I mean, it's all well, it kind of piggybacks onto that. It's all well and good to say that we have to teach history and teach civics in the classes, in classrooms, but when there is no standard for running for office, for pretty much any office, I mean, this seems to be the clear and present danger, that people don't have to have a knowledge of anything, to be quite honest, in order to run for office. Now, of course, we don't want to put standards on, such as that you must be white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, or something like that. But there could be a standard of, as you say, knowledge, at least having read and understood, be able to pass a quiz on the Constitution. There's certain standards. In some parliamentary systems, there are those standards. The parties themselves make the standards.
Yeah, they pick the candidates. and stuff, yeah.
So is there any, in other words, what can we do to counteract that? Because we can teach civics, but that may be by the time those people come into fruition as potential candidates, things may have gone too far. What can we do now to make a requirement for those running for office?
Be very difficult to do. Who Elie Mystal is, we have a wonderful podcast through our organization called Broken Law. And he just said, the people that seem to get elected now are people who can yell the loudest and be the angriest person at the county fair. I mean, that's kind of what it's come down to. And, look, I think instead of, blaming members of Congress and so on for this, it starts with the people. When I ran for the state Senate in 1982, knocking on doors, people didn't even want to hear about Democrat versus Republican. They said, we just want to hear your ideas, and people were very civil. And they also split their tickets. And they valued people who were polite and people who were respectful to the other side. So, this is an ethic that was destroyed in part by the Tea Party. I remember being screamed at a town meeting in 2009 where I said, look, why are you yelling at me about climate change? There's bipartisan bills on this. Lindsey Graham is doing this with John Kerry. And they yelled, oh, he's a rhino, a Republican in name only, Lindsey Graham, But things started degenerating. And then, of course, as Carolyn remembers, a couple of our senators, Republican senators, lost their seat because of Republican primaries. So members of Congress weren't saying this to each other. maybe we didn't love everybody that we worked with. But this didn't start with mean members of Congress. This was the people getting angry. And I want to tell you the other thing that worries me the most. I was asked by like a young person's interview at a school, what am I most worried about? Political violence. I mean, it's just, there's a congressman, a guy who does not fit this model that I just described, a Republican from Wisconsin named Mike Gallagher. He's a very conservative Republican. But he was in the Congress trying to figure out what to do about China and actually doing his job. He quit. He just quit. And why? He's worried about his family. And I never walked out that door in Wisconsin thinking that. And I really don't know if I would have even gone into politics, given this, and this is fascism, the fear of violence. And you're going to have to deal with that. I don't see how you can actually make sort of quiz requirements or comprehension requirements, but it's not a good situation.
I've got to say the senator really hit on something very important. I was very much for gun safety, and I would get death threats all the time from gun advocates. They even put some in prison because they were threatening me and my family, and they're death threats. And Congress now has allocated money for safety, for safety provisions you can put around your home to protect your family. And Gallagher, as he mentioned, he was a Republican, but he co-wrote the TikTok bill that passed, one of the few bipartisan positive steps forward in this Congress, and in many other ways. He was, I thought, a very effective, good member of Congress, and he's leaving, I'm hearing tonight, because he's afraid of violence towards his family. But it's not just one isolated. Most members of Congress are getting death threats. Look what happened to Nancy Pelosi. Her husband was almost killed. I think that was one of the reasons she stepped down, was a fear for violence for her family. So it's a real concern in our country, and one that we haven't had before. It really is very disturbing. Thank you, Senator, for raising it.
Not since the Civil War, anyway. There was violence on the floor of the Senate, but we may be back. I mean, one thing that we know is missing, or several things: civility, effectiveness, conscience, and intelligence. And maybe the Senate and House are less than whole because of the absence of thoughtful people like you. And thank you, Senator Feingold. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Chris.